am so happy that I finally get to chat with this amazing woman. I am such a fan of her historical mysteries. This is the fabulous L.A. Chandler, aka Laurie Chandler.
Wow, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. Thank you.
I love your heroine is someone who is spunky and is independent, and I love that you were on a panel about empowering women because that just felt so perfect to me. I don't expect you to restate everything, but I am curious what you were able to talk about when it came to your leading lady.
It's so fun. It was such a good panel because it was a variety of books, but for mine it's the 1930s, and my protagonist is the aide to Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who is a very famous New York lawyer. And it's during the Depression, so he takes over right when Prohibition is ended and everything is corrupt. And so he comes in and kind of cleans house, and I really wanted my protagonist to be a woman, and I wanted her to be in a place of power like that. When I had studied the 30s and when I came up with the idea for the book, I was really surprised that the 30s looked very different than what I had learned about it. I think I had really pigeonholed it into being just about the Depression, meaning shanty towns and everything's black and white and dismal. And the more I studied it, the more I'm like, oh my gosh, like so many amazing things were happening in art and for women and in the world in general, and a lot of that theme of beauty out of ashes, which is, I always have that somewhere in the theme of my writing. And I loved it because I felt like that was perfect. And women were doing amazing things in the workforce, and so I wanted to give her a more powerful role. And so we got to talk a lot about that and a lot about what makes a woman in that, like, save herself, like a strong character. And I felt like for her, it was a lot of her, she had an unconventional childhood, and then her parents died at a young age, and on top of that, she's in the middle of depression. So 2 sets of trauma that, and you have to, I think, even in real life, reinvent yourself, and you can often become stronger with that. And so I wanted that to be a part of her. And my other funny thing I added at the end, we're talking about the sense of place, and how do our sense of place in all of our books add to a strong female character. And I said that, I'm a New Yorker, I've been there for over 20 years, and I put a lot of what I've learned about being a New Yorker in her, and that's partly why I think she's spunky. And I always say there's the one scene in it's either book 1 or book 2 where she just had a rough day at the office and in general, and then she's on the subway and some kid comes and steals her purse, and she's just had it. And I'm like, all of us New Yorkers are like, there is a moment of like, that's it. And so she happened to wear her trousers that day to work, her slacks, which was like a big deal for women to not wear skirts and dresses, so she could go pelting off after the guy and tackles them and gets her freaking purse back. And I'm like, I can see this happening in New York. So I was like, I always say, for me, I used to be much a people pleaser.
Yeah.
And I think you are so tired living in New York that a lot of New Yorkers aren't rude, but we are assertive and we're tired, so we're going to get what we need. And I think it's misunderstood.
I remember that scene. I was like, what if he has a knife or a gun? Is she gonna be okay? I know. I'm going, okay, there's more of the book here, so she can't die.
Just had it.
That's one of those moments where you're thinking, I wish I could be like that. You're going, okay, you go, girl.
Right.
Let me kind of phrase this, because in book 1, she is assaulted. The gun is part of the mystery of the gun she's threatened with is also something she recognizes. Why does she recognize it? But even though that happens to her and she is kind of victimized, I don't think of her as a victim. And so I kind of was curious about how you approach that, because she didn't go within herself. And again, I'm talking about your character as if she's a real woman, because to me she is. She's multidimensional, so I'm gonna refer to her as such. So she doesn't withdraw. It's almost the motivation to get moving. And so I'm just curious how you approached writing that, because you had to handle it with grace, and you did it. And so I'm just curious how you approach that page and that scene, or writing a character who does have trauma, but yet she's still likable, she's still moving forward.
I think that's part of, her, not just DNA, but how she's been raised with her aunt. And I think, when you've had to battle with a lot of circumstances, you either figure out how to move on, but also embrace the difficulty. So book 2 is all about her coming to terms with the ghosts of her past, where her parents weren't what that she thought that they were, and it really causes a lot of her inner turmoil of, she places a lot of value on her intuition and her judgment, and if she's judged her parents wrong, then what else has she judged? And it's hard, and I like it that she's vulnerable like that, because I think, you know, when you are honest about what is difficult, that actually makes you stronger. And so I wanted both of that. I think, you know, for her, for that one, I think she was, you know, it was more of a physical, like, you know, gun assault kind of thing, but it wasn't damaging physically. And I think she was able to put things into a bigger picture too. And honestly, you know, it's a rough time, you know, so things like that. And she works in the mayor's office, and the mayor really was in real life, you know, getting threats constantly. And, you know, living in New York even today, you know, there's crime everywhere, and you have to deal with it. You can't deny it. You can't just, you know, put your head in the sand. And I think that was part of how she overcame it too, of addressing the grief of it, but then also the strength to figure out how to just keep moving with it.
Oh, I love that answer so much. She's also fascinating to me because you're alluding to and referencing for book 2. This is where you make the character real, because she does have that moment of questioning. I love it in certain mystery books when all of a sudden the killer is revealed and they've been right under your nose the entire time, and then they never even question, oh, I totally misjudged, or oh, I totally should have noticed this clue beforehand. In the next book they're saying, I have a good judge of character. I can have a conversation and know if this person's innocent. Meanwhile, the previous book, 300 pages later, not so true. So you gave the character in that moment depth that I think some mystery novels or novelists don't take into consideration. She's also questioning the mystery, but yet at the same time, she doesn't hesitate to question herself. And that's why I'm so utterly fascinated by her as a character and the driving force of the narrative, because that's something I don't think we see all the time. And usually if it does pop up in mysteries, it has to do with the correlation to the mystery itself, not necessarily the character growth.
Interesting. Yeah, you're right. That's a really great perception. And it does bother me for those same reasons, because I always feel like, I mean, I think characters have to be multidimensional, and that means that they have to have their own weaknesses. And she's a very strong person. So you know, in fact, it's funny because the other thing that it is a pet peeve of mine, and I also hate when they dither about certain things. Right? I had this question about romantic interest, and it ties into this idea of being self-aware, because one of my biggest pet peeves in mysteries is that I'll be reading, you know, any genre, but it's kind of a mystery or whatever, and then I'm reading the protagonist, and she's like confident and she knows what she wants and stuff, and then it comes to love, and suddenly she's like dithering around, like, I don't know what I want, and then from like many books, and I know a lot of readers and writers love to like pull out long romance, like a slow burn. But when it comes across as dithering, I'm like, why? She's so confident in all these other areas except this. To me, it seems disingenuous. So that's why for her love interest, she knows what she wants. And I like that, you know, it's not that they have a smooth road, but it's not that dithering.
That was one of my questions, because
was it?
I appreciate your pacing with the romance.
Oh, good.
So that was something I was intrigued by, and I made a note of to speak with you about, because it seemed very deliberate, but also authentic.
Oh, good. You know, I just felt like it was her. You know, I think if I had done a character that was, you know, a slow burn kind of character, it might be different, you know, and I think I really wanted, you know, in book 2, when she and her romantic interests do have problems, and there is another person in there.
It's not a love triangle in my way.
It's not. And it's also, it's more about the power is her questioning herself. And I really liked that. And I liked it. I wanted her to be unafraid to grapple with those hard things. And that's one of the reasons I put her with her Aunt Evelyn is one of my favorite characters. I adore her to pieces. And I felt like that would, I really think obviously a lot about my characters.
I love the way you refer to them, like, I mean, again, the first name basis, but you're like, Aunt Evelyn.
Yes.
It's so great, because they're real to you, and
They are.
that's probably why they're jumping off the page, because they're going to be real to readers if they're real to you.
Oh, so great. I'm so glad you feel that way. I felt like, that would be how she would be raised, and then I really think the other thing that goes in with her being honest about herself and her strengths and weaknesses is the idea that this Aunt Evelyn character is really probably the most molding character in her life, outside of maybe Fiorella LaGuardia too. But she's an artist, and artists have this way of bridging the gap and saying things that just regular words and situations are not able to do. And I felt like it's honest, and I felt like that would be in her makeup, and so I wanted her to have those abilities. And I think honestly it's more, like you said, it's a more three-dimensional person instead of just being so straightforward.
The nuances, the details that grounds the characters so that they do jump off the page in that way. I mean, clearly you do research for your book because of the historical context, and I'm going to ask you about that in a second. But the characters themselves, I need to ask you about kind of the writing process, because the way they're written, I can't imagine you sitting down at a blank page and just going from the get-go, because they're just so detailed and there's so much depth to them. I can't imagine that coming out in the first draft. Like, your writing process must be something incredible to make sure, okay, we have this little hint for the mystery, and then we have this line over here that's going to show us this characterization and this moment of growth. I'm just curious, do you have a character kind of bio of, oh, this is what happened when she was in 5th grade, and this is what happened over here when she was 10? I'm just curious how you're creating these characters. There's so much depth.
Thanks. I say it's in layers. I think that, like, come up with an idea for a character. Like, for instance, we'll take Aunt Evelyn, just because we talked about her. She's actually, the idea of her came from a friend of mine who's a quite famous artist, and I went into his studio once, and he had the most funky conglomeration of people surrounding him, all in earnest conversation, and they were so diverse, all different ethnicities. One looked like he just came off of a drag show. One is like dressed in like a 3-piece suit for certainly going to Wall Street, and then a real scrappy kind of teenager. I think they were all talking like peers, and they were intense, and I was like, I love that. I love that artists have this way of drawing a lot of people together. So Evelyn, for instance, I wanted her to have that capacity. So she's friends with like Eleanor Roosevelt and prostitutes and everything in between, and I liked that idea, and I come up with things like that. So I might start writing bits, but I usually do, some of that comes to play as you're going, and I will come up with ideas as I go, and I'm always putting notes in my phone. If like something happens and I'm like, ooh, this character needs to have that tick or that's a great gesture, or I'll write that down and put it in. But then my favorite part of the writing process is like drafts 2 and 3. Like, you finally write the end, and then the magic happens more in the later drafts, because that's where you go back and you can add, you put more of the texture and you put more of the nuanced things that you're like, oh, that's right, I do allude to that later. I should have some kind of like, maybe there's like a premonition over here or whatever. And I love those layers, because I think you're right. I think even as a writer, that's where they come alive to me too, because it's not like the plot is now done and you can really, study them a little bit more and add those interesting things in that, they come alive to you too, Yeah.
I like that you're kind of doing draft 1 is the narrative itself of, we have plot point A, B, C, and then round 2 is the emotional growth and the details to enhance A, B, and C. But I am curious though how you go about editing, because the red pen is very scary, track edits is totally its own little thing. How do you make it so that it's approachable and it doesn't seem daunting, because you've just written how many thousands of words?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. It's I think in and of itself it is always daunting, and I always get like, especially when it's edited, then like when I get it as best as I can, and then I send it to my agent or then the publisher and it comes back, I'm always got this like pang of anxiety. You're like, and then, but it's always helpful. So once you start digging in, it gets better. And every agent and editor I've ever had also writes positive things in there, which really helps me a lot because I understand more that I'm getting across what I wanted to get across. So, they'll say, "Oh, this part's really powerful," or "Oh, I really love this," and as well as the red pen. But that helps me dig deeper, and you need it because I tell this to a lot of writers of anything, essays, articles, books, is that you will never read your work like a reader will. So you can't, you're in your head, you've created everything. And that's why I'm an excellent editor for other people that are not even just like, where's the holes, but like grammar and everything too. But I think when you created it in your head, your brain will literally put things, what it sees on the paper, and it's not really there. And so the other thing I do for that is when I finally get to some of those rougher stages that are done, is I read it out loud. Because it is, I really do, the whole entire book. And I often put my cats in the room and read to them. And I have a pen and I take notes, but it's really great because it helps you when you're speaking those lines, your brain can't fill in that stuff as much. And the other thing I try hard to do is really, really work on what what was in my brain literally on the page, because it's hard, and I listen to music a lot, and so I might feel a lot of emotions in a certain chapter and be like, is it really on the page though? Or am I just feeling it because I felt that way when I wrote it, or the music? And then being brutal with yourself of being like, let's make sure, it's all there. And so that's how those layers come in.
Although I am curious and slightly concerned, when you're reading out loud, do you have a cup of tea nearby? Because your throat,
I know.
That has to have its own little side
effects. Yeah, it's a lot of talking, and then sometimes I just talk in lower voices or whatever, or take breaks, and sometimes I'm silently, but yeah.
One of the reasons why I was making note of your potential to sit down at the computer with nothing, doing the total pantser approach, is because of the details with the historical context. Because in my head, you have to have some notes or something nearby to have the timeline or some sort of idea of, okay, this is what the fashion is. So I needed to ask you about how you did your research, because it's so thorough. And I know you do kind of reference things, and you have the bibliography reference, I think on your website or somewhere you have a bibliography.
And in the books too, but yeah.
So I was just curious, how did you find those books, or how did you do your research to extrapolate what was useful to you?
Right. I do a variety of things, and I am always taking notes, like I said. So if I found a really interesting book, I'm writing notes, and I tend to write notes on my phone because when I'm writing fast, I can't read my writing that well, and so the notes on the phone are much better for me. And so, or type it up, as I go. And but I like to find sources that aren't just his history books or whatever. So I love getting vintage magazines. I do a lot of, my husband is actually really great at finding obscure things. Like for instance, I think his book too, I have one of my characters travel on the Hindenburg, which usually people know about the big crash of the Hindenburg, like it was a Titanic, but it wasn't just a one and done thing like the Titanic. It was going across the Atlantic constantly. It was the quickest form of travel from Europe to America. So I happened to he found this great, I found an essay that was on a journalist, took this, wrote an article about his ride on it, and it was so detailed, and it had so many cool pieces of information that I was like, this is incredible. And then my husband found a whole book on the Hindenburg that even had pictures of like the tickets and stuff, and like the menu and stuff, because they have a whole like dining room, they had a piano, and it's like a cruise ship. And I didn't know that. I thought it was just, I didn't know, but they had berths and everything. So all those are like gold. And I found this one great book that was, if you can find books that were written in the day, I think those are priceless, because there's this book called New York, City of Cities by Hulbert Flipner. And it's this big, big book. But what it really is it's a travel book. But it's, it's like, I don't know, 500-700 pages. And what it is, it's narrative. And so it's not just, I hit the highlights of the Empire State Building or whatever, but it was in 1935, like when my book was. And so he's telling what it was like to get on the subway or to go to the police department. And so he goes and visits. That's where there's this whole scene where I can't believe they really did this, but the detectives back then and the NYPD, this was in the book, and this again, the stuff you don't get in normal history books, is he said that on certain days of the week, the detectives would gather all the people who'd gotten arrested, and they had like an open mic night. And so they put this microphone in the middle of the room, and everyone who was arrested gets a chance to plead their case, and they decide if they're going to arraign them or not. And then the smarter criminals knew that if they could get a laugh out of them or something, they might go easier on them. This is all in that book that I found, and I'm like, this is gold. So that's why I think if you can find items that were written in the day, or like I talk about this in the book, but in 1936 Life magazine came out with its first new book or whatever, and so I got a copy of it, and it's so much fun to look at, and it's so much fun. The best part is the advertisements. Like, you really get a feel for what it's like and how much people smoked. And so I think you really get a better feel for fashion and what it was like of it in those ways. Yeah.
I mean, a simple Google search or something won't yield these results, though. How did you go about actually finding those books? Because I feel like those might be difficult to actually locate. Or in my own little head, I'm thinking, if they're rare, they must be expensive to buy or find.
Yeah, sometimes they're not. And I think, I I do a lot on Google, but it's like, it's what you're looking for. So I first started out by actual modern day books that were more like, there's a great one that's called The Napoleon of New York, and that was about Pearl Dagger, and there's a lot of great information in those too, because they're not textbooks, they're like actual books that are more biographies, and so there's a lot more detail than what you might expect like in history class in 11th grade. So those I started with those, and then they reference a lot of books too. And so if something struck my fancy that I was like, ooh, that might be interesting, or I do a Google search about life in the 1930s New York City, and then you start realizing like that New York City of cities. I think I heard about the name Hobart Bittner first, and I saw it referenced, and I was like, a travel book, but it didn't sound like it, because it's not like what we would ever consider a travel book. It's too wordy, and it goes to all these places that tourists don't do. It's like the detective station, the police, precinct. So, but that's why you kind of keep following the thread a little bit, and then when I took a look at it, and then a lot of old books are online, and it was not expensive. It was shocking, but I think people don't go. And then the library is a great source, and the librarians I always say rule the world, and so it's always smart to go ask and see what they have in their files. And but I'm a real texture person, so I'd like to have it, so that's why I tried to hunt down some of those magazines myself, so I could touch it and look at it, and stuff like that. So, but yeah, both are great.
I almost feel like you have multiple historical details that you have to account for. So maybe you have one book on the Great Depression, one book on the fashion, one book over here about the layout of the city at the time, because there's so many things you have to account for. I think that's where I get really, really impressed, because you have to know, oh yeah, Mary Jane's were here. I mean, she does run around in her Mary Jane, which I also love, the fashion reference. But again, you had to look that up. I can't imagine you getting every single detail from one book. So I mean, it has to take a great deal of time doing the research, and that's before or during the writing process, and it's going to add to however long it takes you to finish.
Yeah, it is, and that's laborious, when you're adding in those layers too. That is the one I would put in a little bit of fashion, and then I looked up vintage patterns to see what they would call certain way lapels were or whatever, or even just to see what prints that they would have, and at least to add some texture that way. And it's hard, and it's because you want, but you know what, also I like having some details, but then not so much that it takes away from the story too, because that was they had a lot of slang in the 1930s, but I am not a big slang person, because I'm so taken out of it. Like, if it's one that we still kind of would understand in our day and age, like the bee's knees, it's like, oh, that's great, it's cool. I can say that. But I read a couple books a long time ago, I don't know what it was, but it's so full of slang, and I didn't understand what they were saying, and so I am pretty ruthless with, when I'm rereading things, what takes you out of the story. And for me, it's a little harder I like some historical stuff, and I have to pull it back sometimes, because maybe I'm geeking out about some cool thing that happened in that time too, and I'm like, is the reader, is it helping the story? So maybe I need a flair of it, not a dissertation. So I try hard at that, because everybody has that. I always say it's the moment where have you ever noticed when you're reading a good book and you're so absorbed in it, and all of a sudden you read something and then like you're aware that you're reading and you're reading but you're actually thinking about something else, it could be that you're just tired or something too, but often it's that there's something in it that took you out of the story.
Yeah.
So I'm always looking for those.
I love how you actually were saying you needed to pull yourself back, because that's something where I'm going, oh, I did this research, I want to get credit somehow. I mean, again, I know I'm not getting graded, but it's one of those, oh, I found this thing and I really want to include it because I found it and I feel like my time needed to be well spent. So the fact that you're able to self-censor or self-edit in that way is very impressive.
That's good. Yeah, it's not easy. And you know what? Other editors will help you with that too, because sometimes, like I said, you'll never read it the way a reader will. So there are times I can't see it, or maybe I would want that, and then maybe my editor would be like, well, let's scale it down a little. Or the other thing you can do is, if you're really, and I've done this in some of my notes before, is I can put in some of that yummy history stuff, but just in the notes, and it's not in the story then, but it's still there, so that you're like, this is interesting,
I just love that you use the phrase yummy history stuff. That might be my new favorite thing that's ever been uttered. Yummy history stuff.
It's like the
great.
Hindenburg. It's so interesting. There's things I'm like, they had a smoking room on the Hindenburg. So it's like there's these hydrogen bags and they're flying miles above the Atlantic, and we can't do without a smoke for 48 hours. Or, so it's like, I love that stuff.
That's something I think readers appreciate, because this is where your love for this time and doing research shines, because you can totally tell when someone finds it just very frustrating or time-consuming, going, oh, I need to do this research. This is probably why it feels more organic, and why it feels as if, okay, here's a detail that adds and enhances versus I'm going to throw a detail in there to ground this. It just reads differently.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm glad. I hope that's actually, it's true, I would imagine, because it's like, if you are excited about it, you're more genuine, because it's not just, oh, I gotta do this. So yeah, that's a great point.
Do you have a degree in history?
No, I have a degree in English literature and public relations, but I did gobble up history though. But actually, one of the reasons I feel, I'm not an expert in that area, but I'm close.
I mean, after all these hours of research, I would imagine you must be one of the top scholars.
But when I was trying to figure out how to write a novel, I had this idea, but I also had the idea when life got really, really busy, and I couldn't figure out how to do it, and it felt like a luxury when I was barely surviving. How do I take time to write a novel? But I couldn't read, so that's when I did a lot of my reading, and I kind of think it laid a really great, background to everything, or a foundation, because it was just in me, you know what I mean? Because I had read a lot, because I found that I could do that, and I could do it in bits and pieces, until I figured out a system for writing something. I'd never written anything longer than an article before I wrote that novel. And also, I had a lot of people in my life at the time that were like, they were more, I don't know, like I had a couple fine artists in my life that were treating it like I couldn't do it in small amounts. So one literally said to me, I had said I wanted to do something where even if I can only take it in small bits, like maybe I'll work for 2 hours, on one day, but like for a week, at a week, and then on the next time, and then I'll do it else I can. And they were like, you can't write a novel like that. You need to wait until you get a 10-week beach retreat.
Oh.
I'm like, are you kidding me? Have you ever talked to any author other than maybe Stephen King who waits till they can do a 10-week beach retreat? I was like, that means never write.
Yeah.
And so I had to battle that, because it did feel like it was such a big project. How can I do it in small spurts? But I really do believe you can find what works for you, whether it's a certain amount of time every day, a certain amount of time every week was the best I could do at the beginning. But I just did it. And then I always say it develops appetite, and it starts building. Like, so you start with a scene, and then pretty soon you have a chapter, and then pretty soon you have 3 chapters. And so it grows. And then also, even if I could only stick to that 2 hours a week for a little while, I was thinking about it constantly. And so that actually, I trained myself to do a lot. I will do I'll think of a scene or a character, or I get myself into a spot where like, I don't know what I'm gonna do next, and I sit on it for a couple days, and but I make myself think about it. I love it because I think when you're out for a walk, sometimes your subconscious works when you're not even aware of it, and you'll come up with something. And I feel like that's what I could do, and that appetite, then I would realize, I could get like half an hour on here. Let me get some ideas down. So I did write a novel that way.
I was cringing when you said that they referred to it as a beach retreat, because I'm also thinking, okay, that means someone has to be able to afford a beach house and take time off of work.
10 weeks.
And I'm also going, that's also longer than NaNoWriMo, by the way.
Right.
I mean, it sounds so wrong, because it's going to discourage so many people who could be creative or could do something worthwhile.
That's why I tell people about it, because I'm like, don't believe it. Don't believe that someone says, well, you have to wait until you do that. You will never do it. And I think humans, it's like especially if it's a big endeavor that it's a little scary for us, it's like you do want the perfect time, the perfect energy, the perfect space, but it never happens. Like, you have to create it where you can and make it happen,
Because when you also said, oh, I have a half an hour here, I was actually just thinking what you just said. There was no, I need to light this candle and I need to have the setting over here and have this on like Enya music playing in the background. I mean, you can't waste time doing those little details that you think are going to set you up for success, because that's going to eat away the time that you're writing.
Yeah.
So did you just literally sit down, open up the computer and go, this is my writing time?
Yeah, and what I did, I started out with, because we had really little kids and we were on like a really tight budget, and babysitters are so expensive in New York, so that was part of the problem too. And so I got a babysitter for just those 2 hours. I was like, it's not going to kill anybody for 2 hours. And I just went to the closest Starbucks and just sat down and started writing. And the other thing I got rid of was, my other big stumbling block was, all of the mystery authors that I had read at the time were pretty much always outlining something ahead of time. And so I felt like that was the only way you could do it. And I can't do that. And I had broad strokes. I had some characters developed. I didn't even really know the ending. I knew what the main first crime would be, but that's all. And I tried to do an outline, but I couldn't do it. And I think it's because I feel very strongly for my characters and the situations that they're in. And so that's why I consider myself, it's either, a pantser or plotter. Do you plot an outline or you fly by the seat of your pants? I'm actually an amalgam of the two, because I have to start writing with scenes. And I'm like, just forget it. I'm like, just start with, I already had in my head a scene. I'm like, just write it. And then see what happens. And so what I do is, now, I usually come with a beginning and a middle, maybe an ending. It depends on if it's like, if the whole thing about the book is the plot, then I might know where there's a twist here and a twist there. And I do write it down, and I tend to write a timeline better instead of an outline. And I can see where the holes are and where I need to go. And then I'm like, just start writing scenes, because it's okay if it's not the opening scene. You can add that later, you can massage it, but I have to start. It's like riding a bike. You can't balance unless you start moving. And I think that was for me with writing. I had to just go, and start it. Yeah. And so, so that's how I do it. So I start writing scenes, and then when I get done with that, I'll adjust my timeline or move things around, and then see where the holes are, and then try to think of okay, I have to get from here to here. What is the foundation that needs to be set in order to make it there, and then write those chapters. But if I get stuck to, I technically write it pretty chronologically, but there's sometimes I will jump around. Yeah. In fact, I'm even thinking about that for another book I'm on, because I'm in the first third, but I really know what's going to happen these two major scenes later, and I really, really am craving writing them. And so I think sometimes you need to pay attention to that craving, because sometimes that means, again, you can rewrite it when you get there too. But I think you should kind of go for that. Like, trust your intuition that if you're like really wanting to do it, do it. Don't wait. Because also, maybe it will lead you to adding something over here that you never even thought of. And if you're excited about it, you should do it.
You're reminding me of when writers say, if you don't want to write your story, then why would someone want to read it? Like, you can't. If you're not looking forward to writing it, why would someone look forward to reading it?
It's true. true. It's true.
When you were describing how you approach writing, it sounded as if you were more interested or you were focusing more on the scene itself versus I need to hit 500 words, I need to hit 1,000 words, I need to hit 5 pages. I think the fact you're focusing on the scene is unique, and it's something I'm going, that's a really good idea. Then you can add around it, but you have to have that scene first.
Right.
And so then if that's what you write for the first hour or something, then you can go back and do whatever beforehand or after. The way you were talking about writing the scene, I'm going, oh, this is something I want to highlight. This is a great idea.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because actually I've never articulated it that way, but it's true, because I think I am not motivated by numbers. I am motivated by, sometimes it's better if I'm just like put in time. Like if I'm saying I want to write for so long, because I got, in fact, it was on the last book that I was trying to finish, and I still had 20,000 words to go probably. And oh my gosh, my eyes were glued to that word count, and I'm like, I actually taped over it, because I was like, I can't look at it. I need to just write what it needs to be and not be kind of seeing like, did I get enough? Did I get, and it changed my focus into being something about what I'm excited it to be about, instead of just getting my time in. I think everybody's motivated differently, and you have to pay attention to how you work, and don't worry about it. If other people are motivated differently, that's cool, but don't force yourself to then do it that way. And I think it is better when I'm like, yeah, let's write. In fact, maybe I'll just word it that way myself, of like, let's write a couple scenes.
Really struck me because I'm probably very much like you, where numbers can feel daunting of, oh, I've only written 500, and then I'm depressed. I didn't make more of an impact in the story. I didn't progress something, or oh, I wasted my time thinking about this. And so as soon as numbers come into play, I think it affects my mental or emotional well-being. The other thing I think is really important to keep in mind is that you're saying, oh, this day I wrote for half an hour, this day I wrote for 2 hours. Well, the day you wrote for 2 hours, your numbers are going to be much higher, but yet at the same time, you're probably thinking, oh, this day I was more successful, that day I failed.
Right.
So you can't compare apples and oranges, but it's hard in that moment not to be going, oh, that day I only wrote this amount of words, and today I was great.
Right.
But Tuesday I was so bad.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. That's not motivating, is it? Because if you're doing a success or failure, that's not motivating. And it's human. I mean, we are just naturally going to have days that things just fly, and other times that things are just a lot slower. It's human. So we don't think we should see that as a failure. I think you're right.
Well, I was looking, so again, I did my research before I was going to talk to you. And so you actually have a book referenced on your website, Fight to Keep Creativity Alive. You had it right there on your website, and I'm going, okay, this book must have had a true impact for it to be right there. And I'm going, I needed to ask you about it.
Yeah, it was a book that I wrote because it was some classes that I was starting to teach, because I was having so much fun writing. Once I finally got into that, and I had more friends that were like, oh, what's going on? And I was excited to talk about it, and I just didn't realize that creating that work would energize me so much. And so I had a lot of friends asking me about it, and I told them about it. And every single person, their first response was always, oh, I used to love it when and fill in the blank. All of them had things that they loved to do, whether it was playing guitar, whether it was crocheting, whether it was writing, whether it was acting. And they put it on the back burner because life got too busy, right? And I started thinking about it, and then I did a couple of seminars on it, and then that's where the book came from, because I was just learning a lot about it and understanding myself and how much it was giving back to me. And I think in life, there's a thing about what is urgent is always against what's important, and sometimes the urgent is not what's actually most important. And I liken it to, getting gas in your car versus not putting oil in your engine, and eventually your engine will crack. Right? So we're always so worried about this part of filling up the gas, but are we really paying attention to stuff that feeds our soul? And I think I feel like society is more about what's urgent. We don't. And I don't mind. Some people get tired of the self-care thing, but I love it because I feel like we've not been taught to do that for a very long time. And I think it's important. I think that's why a lot of engine blocks are breaking, because they're not taking care of that. And I think creativity is a really interesting source of that care that I think is underutilized. Usually people think of exercise or vacations and, time with friends, which is all great. but creativity does something even more special, I think. I think it gives back to kind of like who you are as a person, and it opens up a lot that I think the other things are more about maintaining, and I think creating actually creates more space. My idea was that I think people have this sense that creativity or those kinds of experiences you want to go for yourself will happen naturally, and they will not. Life is too overwhelming. You have to fight for it. And so I was cracking up because I had wanted brass knuckles on there, because you said you have to fight for making that space, you know.
Yeah.
And I have switchblades on there. I have like this logo thing that's
it goes with the murder
switchblades.
theme of like, oh yeah, we've written thrillers over here, but over here, okay, we
Little
can
involved.
kind of follow the thread of that.
I remember my sister-in-law was like, I told her I wrote this book. It's like a collection of essays, you know, on things that I'm learning along the way, and she expected to be a cover that was like, oh, I don't know, like a child's handprint with like rainbow paint. And I'm like, no, brass knuckles, switchblades. Like, I think it's got more oomph to it too. You know, even for us, it's not just a hobby, or it's not just I think it's got more power and potency to it. So I wanted to show that.
That's a pull quote right there. Power and potency of creativity. Now you mentioned you have another book coming out, which is also different.
Yeah, I mean, there's two that are with my agent right now, so I don't have a date of anything of coming out or whatnot, but I really love them. And one's a Christmas book, and I wanted to do the same thing that I did with creativity, in that it came from a friend of mine runs this nonprofit that works with the United Nations, and they do this holiday tea once a year. It's always around Hanukkah and Christmas and whatnot, so it always has a holiday theme. And so she came to me one day, and she knew that I like history, and she knows that I do a lot of research, and she says, hey, we have this tea coming up for a whole bunch of women that are coming from the United Nations. Do you do a talk on like the history of Christmas and Hanukkah traditions? And like any good author, I'm like, sure I do, of course. I totally do. And so I went home and was doing some research, and I had the best time. I was unearthing all this like great stuff that was just about like the first Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center, and like menorahs, and all sorts of stuff.
I think you missed your calling. You needed to be a history professor. I'm like, you would have made a great history teacher.
I love it. And the funny thing was, so I did this talk, and it was fantastic. It was just, that was just like a 20-minute version, and then I did more of a 45-minute to an hour version. And it's just so much fun, and it covers everything from like the World War I Christmas truce that happens, and to like the first Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center that was put up by the construction workers building Rockefeller Center. It wasn't a Rockefeller idea. And it's like cool stuff that I thought about the people behind it, and I was like, this would be a really fun book. Like, because what history books don't tell us is like the human motivation behind it. And so that's some of the fiction. So that one's about a modern day journalist that is given, and she takes begrudgingly this, what she thinks is a fluff assignment. And this was my own personal agenda, because I think people think that like holiday books are real fluffy. They're always about a muffin shop. And so I think the holidays have a lot more, again, potency to it, that there's a lot of grit that happens. And these stories that I was uncovering, like, had just so much power to it and were so beautiful. And again, I always love the beauty out of ashes theme. And so this modern day journalist goes to New York City, where a lot of the stories pivotally really happen in real life. And she starts uncovering this. And then when she's talking to the ancestors of certain events and different people, they have a story about how it came about. And so they tell her the story. So you turn the page, and then suddenly it's 1931, Christmas Eve 1931 in the Rockefeller Center. And so the fictional part is I take people who have, some of them are real people, some of them are fictitious, but I create the backstory of why did this certain event happen. Because the one that I found out that was really moving to me was that in 1906, we had the telegraph, but we didn't have radio, and nobody believed that we would be able to get anything over the airwaves and the dits and dahs of the telegraph. But there's this famous radio inventor who worked with the telegraph that believed that we could, and everybody thought he was nuts. So he's in Massachusetts, and this is all real. But what happened was, he even put nobody believed him so much. He put his own radio antenna, giant, on the top of his house. And get this, Christmas Eve night at like 11 o'clock at night, he broadcasts into the Atlantic Ocean and down the coast of Massachusetts. And he reads the Christmas Eve Christmas story from the Bible from Luke chapter 2, and then picks up his violin and plays "Oh Holy Night" over the airwaves for the first time in history. So I was like, I got this idea because I was like, okay, who's the sailor in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, away from family? It's Christmas Eve night, and you hear this miracle of like music coming out of nowhere. Like, who is that? I want to know more. So that's what I wrote. So that's the kind of stuff that I was unearthing, and that's what the Christmas book is about.
And I'm going, I need to read this immediately.
I love it with
incredible.
everything I've got. I love it so much. And there's so much, but there's grit like that. It's not just about, and I feel like, you know, really, I feel like there's not a ton of Christmas books that people who don't like fluffy things, or men in general, read a lot. And I think it's because it's seen as this kind of frosting-y kind of thing, and there's not. Like, there's so many, like, one of my favorite war heroes, there's this amazing real life story that I pretty much tell his whole story from beginning to end. And it takes place during, he's a Holocaust survivor, and he's a amazing hero during the Korean War in real life. And I tell the story because I'm like, and he has a link with Christmas because he's Jewish, but in the end, he's known as the Jewish Santa Claus, and it's so great because he did all this surviving, and he's won all these awards in real life, but it's because before he won the awards, and he hadn't gotten the fame for it at all, and even just the credit for it. He hadn't gotten the awards. He would go to all these veterans' retirement homes for Christmas and Hanukkah and bring gifts and stuff for all the nights of Hanukkah and Christmas. So he's always known as the Jewish Santa Claus. So I'm like, I want to share that story. That's great. I mean, like, it's so, I'm like, I really want to tell that. So that one's with my agent. So I really, 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 really want that to get picked up. And then I have another contemporary one that I have that I say it's like The Breakfast Club meets Big Little Lies. And so it's kind of Breakfast Club Stand By Me. So there's 3 teens in like 1988 that all come from dysfunctional families, but they bond because of that. So that's the Stand By Me, you know, and the Breakfast Club part. And then, but one kid is in serious danger. And then they meet up 20 years later when a dead body's found in their own hometown. And then as they start to figure out who's this dead body and who's the killer, events start to repeat themselves from back then, and they realize they've reawakened a monster. So it's totally different than what I've read or written before, but I love these 3 people so much, and I love friendships a lot. And so it's about their friendships together. And I really, really like them a lot too. So I hope this gets picked up too.
Sold. I need to read this now. This isn't to sound conceited, but I'm thinking, okay, I love history. I've read a number of biographies and autobiographies, and I watch the documentaries with my dad on the History Channel.
I love it. Sure, it's great.
I do, and this is all new to me. I've never heard any of these stories before. So the fact that I think I'm well educated when it comes to history, and then all of a sudden, here's this new detail, I'm going, tell me more. So just tell me everything.
Well, I think, you know, sometimes in history we learn in pockets, like when we're in school, and it's not about what was happening at the same time, and we also don't always look at the human interest part of the motivation behind it, or what it might have felt like to be there then. And that's what I think I like about historical fiction, because there's a lot of reality in it too, and I think you do get a better sense of empathy and a sense of place and time, and I think it's important because and documentaries do that as well. I think even though they're not fiction, it's that still you live it more in a documentary than you do just by reading a sterile textbook or something. So I think that's great. Yeah.
Well, and I love the fact that you found those events and you're able to expand and offer something that's so different when it comes to the holidays.
I know, it's interesting. I think it'll still probably end up being under historical fiction in a way, but it's like, but yeah, I know, it's interesting. And I liked it. I felt like it was interesting making the main character, though, have her own story, too. Because I really loved all these other, it's almost like short stories in the middle of in a novel. But her story had to be important too. You know, that if you had none of those, you were still interested in what she was going through. And I loved it. And I really liked the idea of, you know, coming to an understanding that, you know, when we have holiday traditions, whether you're religious or not, it's often cultural and it has a higher value because maybe it's shared in a community. And that's why I have so many friends of all different faiths that will often get a Christmas tree or a menorah, you know, that are just like, because it's meaningful, and to be part of that in a shared culture, even if it's not your own, is something special. So
the thoughtfulness that you take when it comes to your writing is something I appreciate so much. The human connection, and you're talking about the community. You're placing emphasis on something that's so important. And yes, you need to tell a story, but the fact that you're focusing on those first, I think that's what makes it sound like such a better story and something I'm going, please, please pick this up. Please, I want to read this book. Like the way
please
you
contact
describe
your
it.
publishers.
I'm going, I need to read this book now. Thank you. I mean, the way you're phrasing an approach, I think the fact that you have such a positive energy in the way, it's not the way you're spinning it, but the way you're talking about it and addressing these topics is just absolutely wonderful, and I'm so inspired by it. I'm like, please, please, please publish this book.
I love it. Thank you so much for saying that. I really appreciate that.
No,
a lot.
I'm going, okay, is there a
means a lot.
petition? They better pick this book up, and if they don't, she better publish this. Self-publish somewhere. Because it just
It'll
sounds so
happen.
incredible.
It'll happen.
It
I
sounds so
believe in it
amazing.
a lot. So
But
yeah.
I am curious if there's something about yourself or your writing you want people to be aware of or know or be on the lookout for, whether it has to do with a surprise special fact about yourself or something you're going, this is something my books most people don't realize.
Ooh, that's a good question.
Thank you, I tried.
Well, I mean, you'll realize a little bit, but I always believe so much in art a lot. So that's in the Art Deco books a lot. And then I have in the more modern day, the Breakfast Club, Big Little Lies one. I have a character, really two characters who are artists. One's a dancer and one's more of a painter. But I really love that. And I feel like, and I think that's why writing is an art. I feel like it can change minds. It can reveal things about ourselves and about the world that maybe we hadn't been able to articulate before. And it's in a really more powerful but yet subtle way than like a dogmatic article, you know? And I really like that a lot. And I really love humor. So we have talked about a lot of deeper things, but I like will always have humor in there because I just have to. It's life, and it makes, I love writing scenes where there's humor.
I'm like, we're going full circle because I was nervous, but I also laughed when her leading lady tackled a certain purse snatcher. I mean, that's the type of thing where you're going, yes, it's connected to her emotions, but she is tackling a stranger and you're going, oh my goodness, what just happened?
I love that. It's got life, you know, humor, it gives us a lot of life. And so I love that Lane has, when she's sleuthing with her sleuthing partner, Rourke, her best friend, or one of her best friends, is that she's always getting dirty and messy from their, you know, climbing rocks or whatever in her nice little skirt and Mary Jane's, and then he's pristine and perfect. And she hates it that he's so, like, never gets messed up.
It makes it so authentic and realistic.
Okay.
Like, those are the exact moments and details where I'm going, and yes, that would be me. This is why I would get along with this fictional character. I love chatting with you.
Well, thanks so much. This is so nice. I really, really love chatting with you as well. This has been great.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
chatting
I
with me.
love it.
Oh my
Thank you.
gosh.